It happened on an afternoon like any other. Children walked home from school with backpacks bouncing against their shoulders. Mechanics wiped grease from their hands. Market vendors counted change under the warm Culiacán sun. And then, without warning, the world changed. No alarm. No announcement. Just silence. Followed by a sound that split the city in half. A single burst of gunfire, short, sharp, unmistakable, echoing between concrete walls and palm trees like someone tearing open the sky. People turned their heads. Some froze. Some ran. And within minutes, phones came out, doors slammed shut, and half-formed whispers traveled through streets faster than any bullet. Something's happening. Who is it? Why today? Nobody knew. Not yet. But those who survived that afternoon will tell you the same thing. What started as a rumor turned into a roar. A thunder of engines, convoys, men with rifles long enough to scrape the ground. Trucks moved like predators through the city, block by block, street by street, like a hand closing into a fist. And in the middle of it all, somewhere hours earlier, hidden behind orders and uniforms, someone had made a decision. A decision many now call reckless. Others call courageous. But one fact stands tall above every argument. That single decision was enough to set Culiacán on fire. Within 10 minutes, smoke darkened the skyline. Within 20, neighborhoods turned into battle trenches. Within 40, people began to wonder if the city they woke up in would still exist tomorrow. This was no ordinary firefight. This was a city under siege by its own heartbeat. This was the day civilians became witnesses, some became prisoners, and others, without warning, became casualties of a war they never signed up to fight. A bus burns on a highway. A taxi driver abandons his car in the middle of the road. A woman drops to the floor shielding her child with her own body. And above them all, the rhythm of gunfire writes a language only fear understands. Videos begin to spread online, shaky, breathless, unreal. A man films from behind a car door as bullets tear across pavement. Another records from a balcony, voice trembling, whispering prayers between ragged breaths. No police sirens. No rescue teams, just the terrifying understanding that Culiacán now belongs to someone else. A city of nearly 1 million souls, held hostage in daylight. Because hours earlier, soldiers cornered a man. Ovidio Guzmán López. Son of Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán. A name heavy enough to start a war with just one arrest. And as word spread, something ancient and ruthless awoke beneath the streets. Phones buzzed. Orders moved. And within moments, armored trucks and men in tactical gear swarmed the city like a wave sent to swallow everything in its path. Culiacán didn't fall slowly. It collapsed in seconds. So ask yourself, and hold this question tight, because it will matter soon. How far would a cartel go to free one man? How far would a government go to keep him? And what happens to a city caught between the two? This is not a story of criminals in uniforms. It is a story of a city forced to choose survival over pride. A story of mothers dragging children away from windows. Of soldiers running out of ammo. Of men in black tactical vests blocking highways like they owned them. And in the middle of it, one decision. One arrest. One moment that turned sunlight into smoke. The world would watch. History would record. But no one, not even those who fired the first shots, could predict how this night would end. Because as the gunfire grew louder, as the roadblocks multiplied, as fear climbed through doors and windows like smoke, a question began to form in the mind of every trapped civilian. Who really controls Culiacán? The truth is coming. The sequence of events, second by second, is about to unfold. But before we break down the timeline, before we see how fast a city can burn, and before we witness a government make a decision that stunned the world, remember this moment. This silence before the story truly begins. Because what follows is not rumor, it is recorded history. And once you hear the next minute, you will understand why Culiacán will never forget that night. You are watching True Crime Cartel Originals. Before we dive into today's story, I've got one small favor to ask. If you love deep, real stories like this, tap the like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us which city you're watching from. It helps more than you know, and it allows us to keep bringing you stories no one else dares to tell. Now, let's get into the story. Dawn touched Culiacán gently that morning, like it had 1,000 times before, soft light spilling over terracotta roofs, street vendors unfolding awnings, the smell of fresh tortillas mixing with the sweetness of ripe mangoes on roadside carts. Chickens scratched through dust behind wire fences. Music played from open windows. For a moment, the city was nothing but routine, predictable, breathing, alive. No one, not the laughing schoolchildren, not the men fixing motors in open garages, not the woman sweeping her porch with a plastic broom, could feel the storm building beneath their feet. A storm with no clouds. A storm without rain. A storm made of gunmetal, radio orders, and decisions made behind doors few would ever see. Mothers woke children for school. Taxi drivers washed windshields, hoping for good tips. A father left his home at 6:47 a.m., lunchbox under his arm, believing he would return for dinner. But history has a cruel habit, it rarely warns those it is about to consume. In offices, people chatted about weekend plans. On balconies, old men watched traffic with coffee in hand. A city at peace, but peace is often the quietest moment before something breaks. Before something irreversible begins its slow, unstoppable walk toward history. Deep inside a briefing room far from the sound of morning roosters, men gathered around a screen glowing with intelligence data. A face stared back at them, young, expression unreadable, name heavy with legacy, Ovidio Guzmán Lopez. He wasn't a legend like his father, not yet. But he was a future. A continuation. A bloodline with reach far beyond the fields of Sinaloa. To capture him would be a symbol, a move that could shift power, change dynamics, and perhaps even bring balance. Or chaos. Reports had circulated for months. Surveillance had increased. Patterns were forming, movement, protection, routines. Today, the equation lined up. Everything aligned for one strike, one coordinated motion. A plan set in motion silently, like a blade being drawn without a sound. At 11:20 a.m., the order was signed. By noon, vehicles moved in ways ordinary eyes wouldn't notice, unmarked trucks slipping through crowded streets, radios whispering across frequencies, boots on ground masked by the hum of engines in city life. A normal day, slowly turning into something history would remember forever. A boy sat on a doorstep trading football stickers with his friend. A woman hung laundry in her courtyard, clothespins between her teeth. Street dogs slept in sun-patched corners like little kings of the pavement. Thousands lived this hour unaware that somewhere, behind tinted glass and military armor, a decision breathed, ready to detonate into full reality. The moment before chaos is never loud. It is slow. It whispers. And at 1:48 p.m., that whisper deepened. Trucks rolled past bus stops. Men inside wore expressions unreadable, no panic, no rush, just purpose. Radios crackled once. Only once. That is all that was needed. At 1:52 p.m., a small group of soldiers took positions outside a gated property. They stood still, weapons lowered but ready, eyes fixed. They did not know how history would judge this hour, only that their orders were clear. Inside that home, Ovidio laughed at something on his phone. His world was normal. His coffee warm. His guards relaxed. Had he stepped outside at that moment, he might have smelled jasmine in the garden. He might have heard a distant church bell. But history was already at the gate. At 2:02 p.m., the first breach team moved. Smooth. Silent. No shots. No shouting. Just motion, precise, practiced, surgical. A civilian walking past pulled her child close, sensing something wrong but unable to name it. A shopkeeper paused mid-sale, looking toward the distant rumble of engines. A teacher at a nearby school closed the windows, no reason why, just instinct. And then it happened. At 2:28 p.m., that moment we began with, the city heard its first shot. The sound that snapped a peaceful afternoon in half. The sound that told Culiacán, nothing will be the same now. What followed was not chaos yet, just confusion. People peeked through curtains. Radios lit up. Calls were made. A rumor took its first breath. There's soldiers. They've got someone big. Could it be Guzmán's son? Every whisper ignited more whispers. Every guess tightened the tension around the city like a tightening rope. In these minutes, between the first shot and the first explosion, something powerful existed. Not panic. Not chaos. Something worse. The moment people realize something terrible is coming, but they don't yet know what. This moment is the hinge of the entire story. The place where reality tilts but hasn't yet crashed down. The point where someone, somewhere, still believes it might calm down if everyone just stays inside, if everyone just waits. But history does not wait. Not here. Not today. Because outside that compound where Ovidio stood surrounded, phones were ringing in places no civilian would ever see. Men in ranches miles away were loading magazines. Convoys in hidden garages were already being warmed. Radios were whispering that one name, just one, and that was enough to turn normal men into soldiers, into shadows, into a force ready to burn a city to its knees. The match had been struck. Culiacán simply hadn't seen the flame yet. They opened the case file expecting a straightforward war story, the kind where causes are clear, casualties are counted, heroes are named and enemies are blamed. But what they found instead was a puzzle made of missing documents, conflicting testimonies, and a silence so loud it felt intentional. Because the more they dug, the more the narrative began to shift. This wasn't just about why the Afghans resisted the British, it was about why so many survived except the expedition itself, and why nearly every official record from that month reads like it was rewritten after the fact. One report claimed it was weather. Another blamed cowardice. A third insisted it was treachery from inside the camp. But none explain why 16,500 people vanished in the snow without a fight loud enough to be remembered accurately. The documents read like arguments, not history, each one pointing fingers at everything except the truth. And that's where the obsession began. Investigators would sit for hours comparing testimonies, and every time they thought they were close to an answer, another contradiction surfaced like a ghost from the ice. Someone was hiding something. Or everyone was. As historians followed the trail, one witness statement kept returning like a heartbeat, or the echo of boots crunching snow. A survivor not often cited in Western retellings. A woman from Kabul. Not a soldier. Not a noble. A nobody by the standards of empire. Yet she claimed she watched the column snake through the passes, and claimed she saw something no British report ever mentioned. She described not a retreat, but a burial. A slow, inevitable burial under the cold. Not by the Afghan tribes alone, but by the land itself. The snow came down not like weather, but like vengeance. Men froze mid-stride, horses collapsed in silence, and the dead were left where they fell because there were too many to bury. But here is where history cracks open. Her account speaks of figures emerging from the blizzard. Not soldiers. Women. Afghan women. They walked among the dying like shadows, offering water, bread, fire kindling, not as enemies, not as saviors, but as witnesses. They did not interfere with the massacre. They simply watched it happen. Watched the empire crumble not by steel, but by decisions made long before snow touched the ground. Why help a few, and leave the rest? Why watch, and not warn? Her testimony was dismissed, too poetic, too emotional, too inconvenient to imperial honor. But modern analysts consider it the missing link. Because if tribes alone were blamed, why would women be present? Why would they walk the battlefield without weapons, without fear, unless they knew the land had already chosen its victor? And here's where the story grows dark enough that no documentary softened it. Because if her story is true, then the retreat wasn't a defeat, it was a reckoning. A debt collected for decades of manipulation, broken promises, and the arrogance of underestimating a people who knew the mountains better than they knew their own heartbeat. The Afghans did not just fight them. They waited for them. They watched them freeze, starve, fracture under the weight of their own command. Loyalty broke like ice under a boot. Officers abandoned soldiers. Guides switched sides. Men slaughtered each other for warmth, scraping frozen snow like it was bread. And now we must turn to the image that haunts every historian who studies this event, Dr. William Britton. The lone man who rode into Jalalabad half-dead, blood crusted into his beard, thighs shredded from the saddle, eyes wide not with shock but memory. He did not deliver a report. He delivered a warning. Skin drawn tight over bone, he told them what it means to underestimate a nation that will not be owned. But here is where even his testimony cracks like frostbitten stone. Some documents imply he was not the only British survivor. Some claim others lived, captured, adopted, disappeared into Afghan families, never returned. If true, then Britain was not the last, he was only the one the empire allowed to come home. But Act 2 is not about answers, it is about the doubt that grows when facts do not align. Because now that we've seen the cracks, the buried testimonies, the contradictions, the lone survivor who may not have been lone, we must follow the trail where it leads next. To the letters never sent. The bodies never recovered. The reputation Britain spent decades trying to rewrite. And the Afghan memory that never forgot the snow-covered day empire knelt. We are now stepping into Act 3, where speculation becomes revelation. Where we ask, did the British Army fall because of war, or because history demanded balance? And more importantly, how much of this story was rewritten to hide a truth too humiliating to speak aloud? If you think the retreat itself was the tragedy, wait until you see what was buried after it. History remembers the retreat as if it ended where Britain's horse collapsed, but the truth does not stop at a gate, or at a single man gasping for water. Truth lingers. Truth stains. Truth waits for the moment the world forgets, and then it returns like a tide of ghosts pounding at the shore. Because what came after the massacre wasn't silence, it was revision. Within days, British officials drafted the earliest reports, and those reports did not ask why it happened, they asked how it could be explained. The narrative had to be manageable. It had to be clean. Someone had to be blamed, and it could not be the empire itself. So they carved the story down like a sculptor shaving marble, removing nuance, removing shame, shaping the tragedy into something honorable. Something tragic, but not humiliating. The official record became an armor of words, words that reflected pride instead of accountability. Overwhelmed by treachery. Defeated by savage tribes. A nation united against civilization. Language chosen like a blade. Sharp. Cold. Convenient. But buried beneath that language are letters, private letters, written by soldiers who never returned to England, but whose words survived in Afghan households like relics of a war that should never have been waged. Letters describing dying men burning their uniforms to stay warm. Letters describing officers abandoning mothers, wives, children who followed the army believing safety marched with them. Letters describing the screams, the hunger, the moment hope froze to bone. These letters were not meant for British eyes again. They lived in Kabul homes like war trophies, like confessions. And decades later, when a handful resurfaced in auctions, historians who read them went pale. Because they paint a story not of military defeat, but of collapse from within. Men wrote of arguments between generals. Of orders ignored. Of diplomats bribed. Of guides switching allegiance only when the retreat was already doomed. In one letter, one nearly lost, described torchlight on the final night. Soldiers huddled around fires, listening to wolves howl through the mountain wind, and realizing the wolves were the least of their fears. Because the darkness around them was not empty, it was watching. It was waiting. Afghan forces did not rush them, they shadowed them. Like people who understood patience better than force. The British marched not toward safety, but toward inevitable ruin. Rumors grew that not everyone who vanished died by sword or snow. Some were captured. Some were spared. Some were taken in, not as prisoners, but as new members of Afghan tribes. Men who abandoned the empire to survive. Men who married, raised children, lived lives history never recorded because empire could not admit that loyalty was optional. That allegiance could be shed like a blood-soaked coat. Imagine it. British soldiers sitting cross-legged beside Afghan hearths, drinking tea as snow fell outside. Men learning languages they once dismissed as lesser. Men realizing the land they'd come to conquer was more home than the empire they left behind. If even one such man existed, the narrative collapses. If even one soldier chose to stay, the defeat was not total. It was transformation. And that possibility, that quiet unrecorded survival, terrifies historians more than the massacre itself. Because it means the retreat was not a tragedy of destruction, but a story of absorption. The empire came with flags. The mountains returned them bones. But the land kept the living. So Act 3 takes us not to the snow-covered pass, but to the great rewriting, the political machinery that followed the events like vultures circling a corpse. Public speeches praised British bravery. Pain was polished. Failure was reframed. And somewhere behind the speeches, someone stamped documents restricted. Pages vanished from archives. Maps were redrawn. Testimonies were corrected to align with honor instead of accuracy. Victorian scholars debated tactics and weather, but none asked the question Afghanistan whispered to itself for generations. If only one survived, where did the others go? Because Afghan oral tradition, passed through families, not books, hints at survivors living long after historians marked them dead. Men with pale eyes and foreign prayer, tending goats in high valleys where British boots never returned. Not because they were captives. Not because they were lost. But because they stayed. And if survivors stayed, then survival itself was the rebellion. A refusal to return to a nation that treated men like expendable shadows on a white page. The British Empire returned to Afghanistan soon after, not to recover bodies but to recover dignity. They called it retribution. They marched with fire and artillery, determined to rewrite the mountains with smoke. They burned villages, claimed forts, declared victory. But you cannot conquer memory with cannon smoke. Afghans did not measure victory by land held or forts captured, they measured it by the story children told beside the hearth. And in those stories, the retreat was not a war, it was a warning. A reminder that mountains bow to no empire. That snow remembers footsteps. That the land chooses who survives. The empire left Afghanistan again, not triumphant, not broken, but changed. We rarely hear what Afghanistan remembered. We hear what Britain needed us to believe. But history is not obedient. It leaks. Through letters. Through whispers. Through artifacts dug from the passes like bones rising when frost melts. And that brings us to the part of Act 3 that few retell, the discoveries made more than a century later. Bones uncovered not in one place, but scattered like breadcrumbs across the trail of retreat. Some skeletons were found together, curled against each other for warmth. Others lay alone, half buried, faces turned toward the sky as if asking the clouds for answers. Among these remains were items that do not appear in military inventories: children's shoes, women's shawls, toys. Evidence that civilians marched and died, though records minimized them to footnotes. History cleaned its pages. But the ground never forgets ink. Archaeologists found buttons etched with regimental numbers. Silver lockets with portraits long faded. And coins, British coins, traded, dropped, lost in the snow. Artifacts of empire returned to the earth. But the most haunting relic was this. A rusted musket fused with an Afghan Jazile barrel, melted together by fire, welded not by design but by fate. Two enemies fused into one weapon. A symbol of the war's real ending. Not victory. Not defeat. But merging. And now, as our narrative reaches its end, we confront the question that threads through every testimony, every bone, every document erased or rewritten. Who truly survived the retreat from Kabul? Was it Dr. William Bridden alone, riding into Jalalabad like a prophecy? Or was he simply the only man allowed to return? If others stayed, if even a handful adapted, assimilated, lived, then empire did not return home triumphant with a solitary survivor. It returned home emptied. The land did not merely destroy an army, it consumed it, digested it, absorbed it into itself. And that possibility transforms everything. Because if Afghanistan didn't kill them, if Afghanistan kept them, then the retreat wasn't a massacre. It was a reclamation. A reversal of conquest. A story where invasion ends not in triumph or defeat, but in erasure. Not disappearance, transformation. History recorded one survivor. Memory remembers more. And the truth lies somewhere between them, buried in snow, carried in blood, whispered in mountain valleys where empire became ash and ash became legend. It began with a sound, not loud, not violent, not even threatening. Just a low, distant thrum in the air, like distant machinery or the slow churn of thunder buried behind clouds. Soldiers thought it was nothing, a passing engine, maybe another convoy repositioning. But then the noise grew. A second engine joined it. Then a third. Then 5 more. Until the entire sky above Culiacán vibrated as if the city was caught inside the chest of some breathing, ancient animal. That was the moment the heavier weapons appeared. Not rifles. Not handguns. But .50 cal machine guns strapped to the roofs of armored trucks, the kind that tears through concrete, metal, bone, memory. Trucks modified in backyard workshops with welded plating, gun turrets cut from stolen military steel, engines tuned to chase death like a race it intended to win. The streets shook under their arrival. The counteroffensive had begun, organized, coordinated, merciless. From rooftops, men appeared like ghosts that had been waiting for their cue, black clothing, faces hidden, rifles slung like extensions of their will. Snipers. Patient. Unseen. Deadly. They watched the soldiers below with the stillness of statues, waiting for orders that needed only one word. Fire. The first soldier dropped before his unit even knew where the bullet came from. A second fell an instant later, clean shots, perfect placement, skull and chest, no sound but the quiet whisper of death slicing air. Panic spread like fire in tall grass. Troops scrambled for cover, but how does one hide from a scope designed to erase you from history with a twitch? The police tried to hold intersections, but one squad car reversed, then another. Officers abandoned their posts, some throwing down their weapons, others disappearing into alleys, deciding that survival was better than bravery. Radios crackled with orders, but fear jammed every frequency. The city's protectors were breaking, dissolving like ice under a blowtorch. The cartel wasn't just attacking. They were proving dominance. Street by street, block by block, like wolves reclaiming territory from a stumbling shepherd. The government had underestimated them. Believed they were just criminals. Just thugs with guns and tattoos. But what stood before them now was something else entirely, an army. A force with infrastructure, discipline, command hierarchy. They weren't reacting. They were executing a plan. And every minute that passed tilted power toward them. Then came the message, short, sharp, delivered through radios, intercepted phone calls, whispers across terrified city blocks. Release him. Or the city burns. Not a threat, a promise already unfolding. Government officials gathered inside a secured building thick with arguments, fear, ego. Some demanded negotiation. Others refused to bend, insisting surrender would make them look weak. But pride has a cost, and Culiacán was already paying with fire and bodies. The split grew like a crack in the foundation of a dam, and behind it, pressure surged. No one could agree. No one could lead. And indecision became its own kind of violence. Meanwhile, civilians hid inside homes where walls felt too thin, as if sound alone could break them. Mothers covered children's ears. Fathers paced hallways, waiting for a knock they prayed would never come. But prayers are fragile in cities held hostage, and the cartel had already shifted to a new strategy. Hostages. They blocked highways leaving Sinaloa, dragging innocent bystanders from vehicles, from markets, from buses. Men. Women. Even children. Human shields placed in front of convoys, used as currency in a negotiation that was no longer about politics or law, but raw survival. Gunfire now came in waves, not random, but rhythmic, strategic. Blockades formed like steel jaws around government installations. Every soldier moved like prey. Every helicopter became a target. Every public official a hostage in waiting. The counteroffensive was no longer just a response. It was domination. And then, the call came from Mexico City. Negotiations, they said. Discussions, they insisted. A possible compromise. But compromise with an army holding a city's throat? What leverage remains? Hours stretched like wire. Tension became physical, heavy, suffocating, crawling under skin. Soldiers clenched rifles not like weapons, but like anchors keeping them from floating into panic. Commanders whispered among themselves, unsure whether their decisions would save the city or destroy it more efficiently than bullets ever could. Rumors ran faster than trucks. Ovidio is already moved. They're surrounding military housing. They're coming for the families next. And silence followed each whisper like a shadow afraid to be seen. This was war without borders, where battlefields were neighborhoods, where casualties could be anyone with bad luck and a beating heart. The cartel convoy reached its final stage. Heavier trucks. Bigger guns. More men than before. As if each passing hour fed them strength instead of depleting it. Some wore tactical vests marked with their faction. Others slid bandanas over faces not to hide identity, but because anonymity made them feel like death wearing a human shape. They moved like men who believed they had already won, because maybe, just maybe, they had. But the government still had one last card, the military base on the outskirts of Culiacán, reinforced, fortified, the last island of control in a drowning city. If that fell, everything fell. Convoys headed toward it. Helicopters circled overhead like vultures impatient for the dying. Snipers adjusted scopes, zeroed in, waiting for a clearing, a mistake, a heartbeat long enough to exploit. The government demanded more time. The cartel gave them none. At 7:47 p.m., explosions lit the horizon, not random, but synchronized, like fireworks celebrating the death of order. Shockwaves slammed windows. Dogs howled. Alarms wailed through the city like grieving mothers. Flames climbed into the sky, turning smoke red, orange, then black. The counteroffensive had reached its peak. And in that moment, one truth became undeniable. The government was not fighting criminals. It was fighting commandos. Warriors. A machine built from desperation, loyalty, and blood. And they were winning. The president was briefed. High-ranking officials argued until their voices cracked. Advisors paced like men waiting for a hanging. And through it all, one phrase echoed louder than gunfire. If they're willing to destroy Culiacán to get him back, how far will they go next? There was only one answer. As far as they needed to. The decision would define not just the night, but history. The next moment would tilt the continent. And everything the world believed about power, law, and justice was about to be rewritten. We move now. To the moment the city breaks. The government's confidence had not simply cracked. It had fractured, like glass under a scream. What began as a tactical operation had become something unrecognizable. No longer law enforcement versus cartel. Now it was Mexico versus something more powerful than fear. Culiacán wasn't just under siege. Culiacán was owned. Inside the military command center, fluorescent lights buzzed like nervous insects. Officers stared at screens filled with burning roadblocks, hijacked vehicles, convoys crawling like armored centipedes through the city. Maps updated faster than orders could be spoken, and every update carried one message. We are losing. Not ground, control. You could feel it in the silence. A silence that trembled. The city outside felt it too. Families huddled on tile floors, curtains drawn, lights dimmed as though darkness could hide them from bullets. Mothers whispered rushed prayers into trembling hands. Fathers stood at windows clutching kitchen knives, hopeless weapons, but symbols that they were still alive, still fighting something they could not see. Culiacán was no longer loud. No more engines, no more shouting. Just a city holding its breath, waiting to be chosen or spared. Then came the message everyone hoped they misheard. The cartel has taken the families of soldiers. Not hypothetically. Not strategically. Physically, mothers, children, siblings. Dragged from their homes. Lined up on rooftop edges. Placed inside convoys, crying with taped mouths and shaking hands. Not as hostages. As leverage. A soldier's cell phone rang inside the base. Then another. And another. Voices on the other end were calm. Almost gentle. If you want to see them alive, we want one thing. Release Ovidio. It hit like a heartbeat stopping mid-beat. This was no longer a military standoff. It was a moral crucifixion. Inside government command, tension became weight, a physical, choking gravity. One commander punched a wall so hard his knuckles split. Another sat down, head in hands, whispering. This is no longer a negotiation. This is a countdown. Men in uniform, trained for war, were now being asked to choose between duty and blood, the country or their children. And outside, the cartel tightened the noose. Roadblocks now glowed orange with fire. Gunmen patrolled like reapers, confident, unchallenged. Snipers rotated shifts. Trucks refueled. Convoys multiplied. The cartel was not tiring, it was growing. They were preparing to do the unthinkable. Mass civilian executions if demands were not met. The president received the call. His advisors argued like wolves over a single scrap. Half demanded resistance, half begged surrender. Neither side was wrong. Neither side was right. But time was a wound bleeding faster each minute. Every choice was a loss. Every delay, a death. Inside Culiacán, children cried into blankets to muffle sound. Streets were empty, except fires, and fear walking on two legs. This was not chaos anymore. This was ownership. And then, everything slowed. Like time itself hesitated. Government officials signed for a secure line. A message appeared. Not handwritten. Not verbal. A video file. They opened it. A rooftop. Night wind. A child on their knees. A masked man behind them holding a rifle. No sound. Just eyes wide with salt and terror. It lasted 8 seconds. 8 seconds that rewired every heartbeat in the room. A general stood, face pale as ash. We're done. We lost this city the moment we agreed to fight it. But another voice, younger, angrier, rose from across the table. If we surrender, we show the world we cannot govern our own soil. 2 truths. Both fatal. This was the breaking point. Not just for Culiacán, for Mexico. Soldiers inside the base started submitting resignations by voice note. Not to abandon the fight, but to go home. To exchange rifles for arms wrapped around wives and sons. Not cowardice, humanity. Outside, the cartel made its final demonstration. Fireworks, not for celebration, but domination, boomed across the skyline like artillery dressed in color. Radiant bursts lit smoke and flame, turning destruction into spectacle. The message was clear. We can turn war into a festival. And no one can stop us. The government was no longer facing an army. They were facing a nation within a nation. One built on blood loyalty, not law. One fueled by narco-economy deeper than government funding. One willing to burn a city alive for one man. And as negotiations reached their final thread, the world realized something chilling. It wasn't about Ovidio. He was the spark, not the fire. What burned tonight was who holds power in Mexico, and who does not. At 11:52 p.m., a message left the base. Short. Quiet. Defeated. We will release him. A decision that would define history not by words, but by the taste it left in the nation's throat. Relief and shame arrived together. Gunfire stopped. Engines idled. Snipers lowered weapons. The city exhaled, not in victory, but survival. Because Culiacán did not win. It simply did not die. The cartel convoys vanished like phantoms. Roadblocks cleared with eerie efficiency. Fires dwindled. Streets remained empty, not from safety, but shock. Families emerged into silence, stepping over bullet casings like relics of a war they never enlisted in. Mothers hugged children so tightly their bones hurt. Soldiers walked home not as heroes, but as men living inside a question they could never answer. What was the right choice? And what did it cost? As sun rose over the city, every shadow felt longer than usual. As though darkness was reluctant to leave. Because night may have ended. But the world would never forget what happened in those hours. A government bent. A city bled. Power changed shape. The night Culiacán fell isn't just a story. It's a mirror held up to a nation. And the reflection doesn't blink. When law loses its voice. And fear learns to speak louder. Who really rules? Time did not move inside the command room. It dragged. Slow as blood drying on concrete. Heavy as truth no one wants to speak. Screens flickered with flames, radios hissed with static, phones vibrated like trapped insects. Yet the room itself was still in the way a courtroom becomes silent right before sentence is passed. Ovidio Guzmán sat in custody. Breathing. Waiting. He wasn't shouting. Wasn't pleading. Not even afraid. He simply waited, like a man who knew the city outside was not fighting for him, but because of him. And that knowledge alone made him one of the most dangerous men breathing air that night. Officials circled a long table, voices raw from arguments that never led anywhere. Shoes walked grooves into the floor. Papers shook in uncertain hands. Every second felt like a stone added to a scale that refused to balance. They debated not tactics. Not justice. Not strategy. They debated morality versus survival. If they kept him, thousands could die. If they released him, the rule of law would collapse. Two doors. Both open into hell. One general stood with fists clenched, knuckles white as bone. If we release this man, we are no longer a country. We are tenants paying rent to the cartel. His voice shook, not from fear, but from fury drowned beneath duty. But across from him, a weary commander whispered back. We are not choosing who rules. We are choosing who dies tonight. It was the kind of sentence that ages a man decades in a breath. Outside the compound walls, soldiers withdrew from checkpoints, boots crunching over broken glass and shell casings. Men who had trained for combat now kept heads down, rifles lowered, avoiding sniper windows like eyes of judgment hanging in the sky. They were retreating, not from the enemy, but from the inevitable. Block by block, they fell back toward the base, shoulders heavy with guilt no armor could absorb. Some whispered apologies into the smoke. Others looked up, hoping the night sky would hold answers. But clouds burned orange with firelight, offering no comfort and no instruction. The city, trapped between silence and gunmetal, waited. Homes still locked, windows still dark. Families listening for footsteps. Mothers holding children until arms ached. The air tasted like gunpowder and prayers unsent. Even the dogs stopped barking, as if animals themselves understood history was holding its breath. Culiacán felt like a heart beating underwater. Slow. Muffled. Every beat painful. Time did not pass. It pressed. In another room, high above the crisis floor, a small group of officials faced a decision no textbook had prepared them for. Some voices shouted for strength. Others begged for mercy. One young policymaker, barely 30, spoke softly like someone stepping onto thin ice. If we stand firm, we protect the law. If we fold, we protect the living. What is the job of a government? No one answered. Because answering meant choosing a future the whole world would witness and judge. The debate stretched like a funeral procession with no destination. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. 20. No resolution. Only tension, a rope pulled from both ends, fibers fraying, one heartbeat away from snapping. Outside, someone fired a single round into the air. Not at anyone. Just into the night. A reminder. A ticking clock. Then, unexpectedly, a new sound replaced the gunfire. Crying. Not of soldiers. Not of officials. But civilians, stepping out of hiding, breaking down in doorways, sobbing into open palms because silence meant only one thing. A decision was coming. Somewhere inside that base, pens poised over documents that would shape history. Radio operators waited for command codes, fingers trembling like the city's pulse. Guards stood outside Ovidio's holding room, neither meeting his eyes nor their own reflection. He remained calm. Unmoved. As if he knew the outcome before it was spoken. He wasn't the prisoner anymore. He was the axis of the entire war. And everyone else revolved around him. The president received final intel. Civilian hostages confirmed. Families of soldiers still missing. Highways blocked in every direction. Snipers in position. Cartel reinforcements arriving from 3 states. The situation was no longer deteriorating. It was complete. A single word would determine which future Mexico inherited. A sentence that tasted like rust and surrender. Authorize release. It passed through radios like thunder muted by distance. Soldiers froze mid-step. Officials stared at the floor. The city's breath returned, shaky, painful, relieved, ashamed. At 1:14 a.m., the command was sealed. Ovidio Guzmán would walk free. Not because the government was weak, but because the city was bleeding. Because the alternative was a massacre. Because sometimes survival requires swallowing your own voice. The wheels of the transport vehicle rolled like a verdict. People peeked from doorways, from behind curtains, witnessing history in motion, not triumphant, not proud, but alive. No cheering. No jeering. Just a city too exhausted to feel anything except breathing. Soldiers leaned rifles against walls, sitting on sidewalks like men whose souls needed to catch up to their bodies. Some cried quietly. Others stared blankly at burned-out cars, as though pieces of themselves were still trapped inside. The moral cost of survival hung thicker than smoke. Because in war, winning isn't always victory. Sometimes living is the only prize left on the table. And Culiacán had lived. Barely. But at what price? A question that would echo long after the fires died. The city did not celebrate. The government did not boast. Everyone knew the truth. Tonight, power did not belong to authority, but to whoever was willing to lose the least humanity in order to win. And that realization would shape everything that came next. No gunfire. No explosions. Just the kind of silence that feels like the world forgot how to breathe. After hours of terror, fire, negotiation, and fear woven into every street, the night of Culiacán reached its most unsettling moment. Stillness. Not peace. Stillness. The kind that follows a scream too long and too loud. A silence heavy enough to bruise the air. Word traveled slowly at first, like a rumor unsure of its own truth. Ovidio will be released. No one cheered. No one spoke. People simply listened. Ears pressed to doors, heartbeats hammering like distant engines. They waited. They watched. They felt history shifting, quietly, terribly, beneath the soles of their feet. And then, almost gently, reality arrived. A prison gate unlatched. Metal kissed metal. Hinges exhaled. And the world did not blink. Ovidio stepped out not as a freed man, but as the answer to a threat too large to control. His hands no longer cuffed. His posture calm. Eyes unreadable. No victory. No fear. Just a man walking into a night that destroyed a city to reclaim him. Soldiers nearby looked at the ground, unable to meet his shadow. Some turned away. Some clenched fists until skin tore. Others whispered silent apologies to no one in particular. Because this moment was not justice. It was survival wearing the mask of defeat. The escort convoy rolled forward, slowly, like a funeral procession where the coffin is invisible but the grief is everywhere. Armored vehicles hummed with restrained power. Engines low, steady. Tires grinding on asphalt soft with burnt rubber. Not a war cry. Not a parade. Just motion. Heavy. Slow. Like time itself dragging chains. Civilians emerged from homes like ghosts, blinking into the smoky night, afraid to stand fully upright, as though gunfire still waited behind the next breath. Mothers clutched children tighter than hope. Fathers stared with hollow eyes, knowing the lesson had been carved into the city's bones. Culiacán did not regain safety. It regained air. Thin. Shaky. Almost fragile. The convoy turned through a burned-out intersection, and the sight of it, the reason the city burned, moved through streets like a phantom. No one waved. No one threw stones. No one dared to speak. The city simply exhaled. A slow release of terror built up like poison under the ribs. But even that breath carried weight, because exhaling meant acknowledging what happened. The cartel called the terms. The government yielded. And the people watched. As the vehicles rolled deeper into the dark, Culiacán felt suspended, like a clock with a broken second hand. Movement without progress. Survival without resolution. The fires still burned. The bullet holes still marked the walls. The fear hadn't left, only lowered its voice. A taxi sat abandoned in the middle of a boulevard, windows shattered, engines still warm. A hammock swung in a courtyard where no one slept. Street vendors' stalls remained overturned, spilled candy and cigarettes like offerings to violence. Everything felt like evidence. Everything felt unfinished. And yet, this was the end. Not a clean one. Not a proud one. Just the kind history leaves unsweetened. People stepped onto sidewalks, touching railings, lampposts, walls, as though confirming the city was real, not just a nightmare dressed in gunfire and gasoline. Some began to sweep broken glass. Not because anyone told them to, but because sweeping was something human, something normal, something alive. A man knelt and gathered shell casings into a bucket like bones. A shopkeeper opened her door just enough to light a candle. Two teenagers rode bicycles, slow, cautious, testing the air like animals emerging after a wildfire. Life did not return. It limped. Stillness remained. But now it carried memory. A memory of what power looks like when law has no teeth. A memory of what a city sounds like when courage is measured in breath. Ovidio was gone. but the night he walked free would stain time itself. The convoy disappeared into the distance, swallowed by desert roads and unspoken agreements, and Culiacán stood under a sky that felt too wide, too quiet, too aware. The silence was not relief. It was aftermath. Relief came later, slowly. When mothers tucked their children into beds that still smelled like fear. When dogs finally barked again. When the first rooster crowed before dawn, soft, unsure, but present. Morning light crawled across rooftops like cautious fingers, touching burn marks, shattered windows, roads that remembered fire. And as sun climbed higher, people walked back into streets, timid at first, then bolder, though eyes still flit to corners and rooftops and shadows that might not be empty. Because survival is not peace. Survival is permission to feel again. The city exhaled one final time. Not in triumph, but in continuation. A fragile, trembling continuation. Ovidio was gone. The city still stood. The fires died. The memory lived. And in that balance, pain, relief, dread, and breath, lies the story of the night Culiacán fell. Because some wars end when the guns stop. Others end only when silence learns how to heal. This one has not healed yet. The city did not celebrate. Culiacán survived, but survival is not the same as victory, it's simply the ability to keep breathing. And on that night, as the sun finally crawled over the skyline, its light didn't wash the streets clean. It illuminated them. Exposed them. Quietly asked the question no one could quite answer. What had all of this been for? Hours earlier, the roar of engines, the crack of gunfire, the shouts and commands had filled the air like an iron storm. But now? Now there was only wind cutting through smoke that still hovered over intersections like memories refusing to leave. Burnt vehicles lined the road, some melted into the pavement, some still smoldering, giving off a faint hiss as though the city itself was whispering. People emerged slowly from their homes. Not running. Not smiling. Moving like survivors stepping out from under collapsed walls. Mothers held children with shaking hands. Men swept shattered glass from their doorsteps. Dogs sniffed the streets like they didn't recognize them anymore. Life was returning, but cautiously, nervously, like a person returning to a house that nearly killed them. There was no music, no cheering, no anthem. Only breathing. Only heartbeats. Because everyone knew what happened that night could happen again, not tomorrow or next year, but whenever someone decided it should. Soldiers returned in scattered groups, their uniforms torn, eyes hollow, expressions unreadable. They were alive, but in a way that felt unfinished, as if they left a part of themselves somewhere back on kilometer 15, or in a blown-out intersection, or beside a burning convoy they couldn't save. The government released statements, polished, measured, carefully worded. But statements cannot erase fear. Fear doesn't read press releases. Throughout the city, conversations whispered instead of spoken. They let him go. They had no choice. The government isn't in control, not really. People weren't angry. People weren't relieved. People were awake. And awakenings are irreversible. Shops reopened. Traffic returned. Children walked to school. But trust stayed home. Later, analysts would argue whether the release of Ovidio Guzmán was strategic, necessary, or cowardly. Some would say the government saved lives. Others would insist they surrendered sovereignty. But inside Culiacán, no theory mattered. People had felt power shift physically, like an earthquake. And no explanation can make the ground feel solid again after it moves. This wasn't the kind of story that ends with applause. It ends with a question. If a single arrest can collapse a city, who really holds power? Night returned eventually, quietly, with no gunfire to accompany it. But sleep didn't come easily to anyone. Windows stayed closed. Doors stayed bolted. Every noise outside made people pause and wonder whether the nightmare was beginning again. A mother whispered to her husband in the dark, asking if they were safe. He didn't answer. Not because he didn't love her, but because he didn't know. A teenage boy scrolled through videos taken just hours earlier, armored trucks, convoys, burning buses. His thumb hovered over the screen like he couldn't decide whether to watch or look away. Trauma is strange like that. We returned to the fire to understand the burn. Across town, a soldier sat alone in his barracks, staring at his hands. Hands that had fired weapons. Hands that had shaken while doing it. Hands that survived. He told no stories. He didn't speak. Some things are too heavy for language. In the newsrooms of Mexico City, reporters wrote headlines with shaking conviction, as if naming the events might give them meaning. Chaos in Culiacán. War in the streets. Government forced to release Ovidio. But the truest headline was the one no paper printed. A city learned who it answers to. Weeks passed. The smoke vanished. Glass was replaced. Streets were cleaned. But trauma has no cleaning crew, it lingers like a stain only memory can see. Children who once played freely now looked over shoulders. Fathers left for work unsure if they'd return. And Culiacán breathed, but shallowly. People avoided discussing that night, yet it lived behind every conversation like a ghost sitting silently at the table. The city moved forward not because it healed, but because time does not stop for pain. In social media archives, hundreds of videos fluttered like digital ash, shaky phone recordings, dashcam footage, live streams of fear. One clip showed a young woman praying aloud in her car while bullets cracked nearby. She didn't scream. She didn't panic. She simply whispered, "Please let us see tomorrow." They did. But tomorrow did not come without a price. And somewhere, in a high, unreachable room, men in suits reviewed the night's decisions, some calling it necessary, others calling it surrender. But Culiacán is not built of boardrooms or policy. It is built of people. And people remember. History does not forget nights like this. In fact, history grows from them. As the final chapter of this night closes, we are left with something more unsettling than fear. Understanding. Understanding that a city can be held hostage not by invasion, but by identity, by legacy, by the echo of a name. Understanding that governments can be powerful yet paralyzed. That authority can be legal yet ineffective. That peace can exist without safety, and safety without peace. And understanding that on the night Culiacán fell, something deeper rose. A realization, loud, undeniable, that power is not always owned by those who claim it. Culiacán survived. But Culiacán changed. Because once a city has witnessed its own collapse, it never sees itself the same way again. And neither do we. When we look back on the night Culiacán fell, we don't remember it as a battle in the traditional sense. There was no front line. No final charge. No surrender sign on a table. It was a night defined not by victory, but by exposure. A city stripped bare, nerves exposed, hierarchy revealed. It forced the world to confront a truth many only whispered before. Power is not always visible, but you know it when it moves. And on that night, power moved like a shadow across Culiacán, fast, silent, unstoppable. The government spoke through press briefings. the cartel spoke through action. In the city spoke through silence. A long, unblinking silence. The kind that lingers after trauma, the kind that becomes memory. We think of cities as concrete and metal, but cities are really built from fear, hope, hunger, loyalty. And that night, every rooftop, every street, every barricade became a chapter in a story written in real time, one decision at a time, one life at a time. Ovidio was taken, then returned. Order collapsed, then limped back. No one won. No one lost. Instead, everyone remembered. And maybe that is the most frightening truth of all. Because long after the fires burned out, long after the convoys vanished into the hills, long after the statements faded from the news, Culiacán still remembers. A child who hid in a bathroom remembers. A soldier who closed his eyes under fire remembers. A mother who waited for morning remembers. And memory, once awakened, does not sleep again. We like to believe the world is built on laws, on governments, on documents. But nights like this remind us the real world, the one people live in, bleed in, survive in, is built on power, perception and fear. Culiacán became a mirror. A reflection of invisible structures. A reminder that society is thinner than we think. One decision. One man. One night. And everything changed. History won't forget it. Neither will Mexico. Neither will we. So as we close this story, as we breathe out the final echoes of gunfire still hanging in memory, we leave with no answers, only awareness. Awareness that power can be challenged and reclaimed. Awareness that cities are fragile and resilient. Awareness that sometimes survival itself is the only victory. An awareness that the night Culiacán fell was not just an event. It was a lesson. A warning. A scar. A spark. And in the quiet after the storm, the world listens. Because the world knows. It can happen again.